Welcome to Port Arthur, Australia. It's about 59 degrees. We started this journey out in Sydney at 98 degrees. This is the one side of Port Arthur. We're gonna walk over and see where Andrea is. Take a little shot at the majestic princess. Oh, here she is. She's waving us on. Oh, there's one of the tenders. So this is a tender port. They got water shuttle. You can use another term, water shuttle. And that orange one out there is our water shuttle.
See, that's the prison they were talking about.
That's the prison right there.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Port Arthur. All right, let's go get on our tender and head over to the prison. It's 59 degrees, but really doesn't feel that cold. On this, the tender was telling us there was a mass shooting here about 25 years ago. It was very sad and carries a lot of weight. Still carries a lot of weight today, even though it was 25 years ago. But all right, we're going down. We made it over on the tender. These are people waiting to get on the tender. This guy counts the amount of people that are allowed on the tender. Dockyards that way. Visitor center. Guided tours leave from here. Shuttle service, site talks. The visitor center, lockers, vending machines. When you're at the visitor center, they have playing cards that you pick, and each card represents a single convict, allowing visitors to delve deep into the person's life rather than just learning general information about the prison. It's pretty cool. They had a cool little portal where you can search surnames. So I put my surname in, and this is what came up. That may be relatives of mine, not sure, of course. And then Andrea put in her surname, and this is what she came up with. We may have long lost relatives. All right, I think are we gonna leave her here, or? Your crime is not being nice to your husband. It kind of goes along with the pickpockets. They were brought on this island for pickpocketing. So here's an example of change that they used to wear back in the time in Port Arthur. Give you an idea of what they were carrying for change. And they brought every single criminal here, apparently. That's not replica, that's real. These two items are replicas. The whips. They actually had whips. They whipped. These are surgeon kits. Dentist tools. Here's a map of where prisoners were sent all over the world from Great Britain. Let's head outside, take a look at what's going on. The rise and fall of the penitentiary building. 1842 to 1845, it was a flour mill. 1854 to 1857, penitentiary. 1897, they had a fire. 1912, 1940s, the center had collapsed, which you can see here. 1967 to the present is stabilization. They're basically stabilizing the building.
the three big things that you need to know before you leave this place. Number one, it is a prison for 47 years. It operates between 1830 and 1877, and that means it's not early convict history, which of course started in 1788 when the first fleet went to Sydney. 15 years later, in 1803, is Hobart and Van Diemen's Land, so future Tasmania. Okay, so this is until 1830. Number two, this is a men's prison. You haven't worked that out already? So the only women convicts that came to Port Arthur, they came as assigned servants to the staff here. So there's very few of them. They're on a different system, and their story is told in Hobart in the female factory. Right, so it's not a less important story, but it's not Port Arthur's story. It's so important, it's World Heritage listed over there. Right, which brings us to our third point. Port Arthur's World Heritage listed, and we are on the same listing that the female factory is on, and 9 other sites. The Australian Convict Sites World Heritage listing is really interesting. So there's 11 sites across Australia, but 5 are in Tasmania, 4 in and around Sydney. Fremantle Prison over in WA is one of them. The last one's on Norfolk Island, 1,000 kilometres east of Brisbane. Right? Each site is chosen to be a different slice of the Australian convict story. It's intended that you visit all 11 sites to hear the whole story, and I've not met anybody who has done it. Right, but you've come to the best one. Right, this is the true number 3. Port Arthur is secondary punishment. Right, that's the slice of the story that we represent, and it's not a typical convict story, not at all. So only about 10% of men convicts would see anything at all like Port Arthur. Right, it's not a typical convict story. Right, is this helpful?
Yes. Yes.
Because we're going bigger. Unless you weren't interested. That's where I was going otherwise. Alright, because back in Britain, let's see, where we should start. There's more than 200 hangable offences in Britain. All about property. Property and theft. That's what they are obsessed with. So if you were discovered at night with a blackened face, that is hangable. Did you interfere with a rabbit warren? That's hangable. Chop down someone else's tree, hangable. Destroyed a fish pond, hangable. Spent a week with the gypsies, hangable. Right, 6 days apparently okay. Those gypsies though, right? These are all hangable offences, but Britain don't want to hang people. Not anymore, it's barbaric. But they don't have a prison system that we would recognise. So when they stop hanging people, they've got to send them away, right? And that is genuinely why they came to Australia in 1788. All about theft and property. So that's 3/4 of everyone transported. That's their crime. Only 10% are violent crimes. Murderers are hanged, so they're not transported. The minimum sentence is 7 years. Right? It sounds a lot, but you could have been hanged for it. Suddenly it's okay. The journey to Australia is definitely tough too. It's 4 months or more on those ships. But it is not intended to be tough, or at least not cruel, for convicts in Australia, as long as they do what they are told. You show up in Sydney, you show up in Hobart, 90% of convicts then are placed on assignment, which is a lot like having a job, but you are not being paid. If you could read and write, you might especially be assigned to the government, but ideally they are assigning convicts to settlers, and settlers pay for everything. And there are strict conditions about how much those convicts must work, but also how much they are fed and what they are provided with. Right? And it is a lottery, and I don't want to make it sound too rosy, but for most people, life is actually better than what they have left behind. You might miss your family a bit, otherwise going well. Keep your head down in half your time, so 3 or 4 years for most people, you're then eligible for your ticket of leave. That is your parole. And so many people just stay on those same properties where they are already assigned, but now getting paid. Now it is like a job. But whatever you do, just show up to church every week and keep your head down. It is not that hard to become free in Australia. It happens to so many people. It is tough to get back to Britain. It was a one-way ticket, but not if you have a trade here. There is so much money in Australia. The people that earn the money though, they are the least likely to go back. Like, why on earth would you? Life is better here, and instead work to bring your families to Australia. Buy property here, buy businesses here, and even as ex-convicts, you can have convicts assigned to you to help you establish a new life here, a much better life, right? And that's the typical Australian convict story. That happens to so many people, and I cannot tell you why we don't talk more about those people. That is the birth of modern Australia, right? But it's not Port Arthur's story. Port Arthur, well, they say the worst of the men were here. Absolutely, they're here. I prefer to call them the slow learners. Right? It wasn't enough to be sent to the other side of the planet. These are people who have messed up in the colony, and if they're at Port Arthur, they have messed up a lot, or done something pretty serious to end up here, because they've seen all of the layers of convictism. And Governor Arthur, or Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, he's the first independent governor of Van Diemen's Land, so independent of New South Wales after 1825. He's got 7 layers of this convictism. So instead of going to your assignment and up to your ticket of leave, these are guys who have gone assignment, restricted assignment, then to the work gangs. Everything in Van Diemen's Land is being built by convicts. Road building, bridge building, building, timber felling gangs. And below the work gangs is the worst work gangs, and below the worst work gangs is the even worse work gangs. And below that, Port Arthur. So welcome to the bottom. This is a maximum security prison inside the prison of Van Diemen's Land. But in 1830, it's not the lowest level. It's actually a workstation, because some of the world's tallest trees were here. So that's why they came in 1830 with a few dozen convicts and a handful of soldiers. And 3 years later, in 1833, there's more than 200 convicts here and a few dozen soldiers. But it's all on that hillside there. It's just wooden buildings. Still some tents. A couple of larger buildings down here, wooden, for processing timber. Right? This, by the way, is a beach. So that's the shoreline back as far as the road there. So that gets filled in later. Right, but in 1833 is when it all changes. They closed down Maria Island, which is off the east coast, and they closed down especially Sarah Island, Macquarie Harbour. And this will be the sole secondary punishment for Van Diemen's Land. That's when Commandant Booth was placed in charge. And almost anything that you know about Port Arthur will come from his period. He completely defines this place. He's here for around 11 years. And he takes this from that timber getting camp with a couple hundred men in it to a massive industrial complex. It's busy, noisy, and smelly. There are 1,200 adult men prisoners here. Now they are in wooden barracks, so they're missing, but if you've been down near the crossroads, there's some terraces there, that's where they were living. Almost every building here is built, apart from the separate prison and the asylum, during those 11 years. It's absolutely incredible. And it's not just the 1,200 adult men here. In 1834, so the next year, he's also responsible for the very first juvenile prison in the history of the British Empire. So that's a Harbour crew story, but out on that point of land over there, nearly 800 boys. So as young as 9, but mostly teenagers. Right? An acre of workshops. That's completely missing, but that's on the other edge of this building. The ship yards over there, the 80-bed hospital, this hillside full of the wooden staff housing, essentially, the stone military barracks, his house, which is a bit nicer over there, but for Commandant Booth, that was always a wooden house and only as wide as a veranda, and that's the back of his house. So things are going to change. The church, of course, up that way was early because they need a church. Half of Civil Row was built. And the other things you should know about this place, it's really physical during his time. He is obsessed with escape, and this is a prison without walls. The walls is the landscape itself. So there won't be any animals here during his time. No oxen, no draft horses. And they are building all of this stuff with convicts. So coming out of the forest, carrying 12-metre long beams on their shoulders, a foot by a foot. Those guys have got leg irons on. Right? If you're working in the fields, it's all hand tools. And all of the rock that's coming off the hill is in carts, but that's pulled by convicts. It's really, really tough. And of course, lots of flogging during that period too. And this building, finally arriving. This is Booth's building as well, but it opened in 1845, so the year after he left. The biggest building in Australia. Right, but to explain the building, I just got to rewind just a little bit. So some more big stuff. 1838, there's an inquiry back in Britain. It's into the entire transportation system, and it's called the Molesworth Inquiry. And what Molesworth is on about, he says this assignment system, it's a lottery. And it just doesn't seem fair. You've got hardened criminals being sent over, placed on someone's property, treated like respected farm workers. And the flip side of that, people who've done genuinely minor offences are put with someone who thinks they've suddenly got a new slave. Right? You do have a right as a convict to complain about that stuff, but good luck exercising your rights. But Molesworth said, this is so unfair that it cannot continue. And in New South Wales and Sydney, they said that's no problem at all. We will end everything. And transportation stopped to New South Wales in 1840, as early as that. So for the next 10 years, every convict coming to Australia is coming to Hobart, and there is a lot of them. And poor old Governor Franklin down here, they said to him, well, you can't run an assignment system, you need to run a probation system, where now everybody will work for the government, typically for 2 or 3 years, typically doing hard labour, before you can now assess their behaviour and put them in the appropriate levels that they can advance through. It's huge, because all of that financial pressure being taken care of by the settlers suddenly dumped back on the government. Right? We need to house all of these people, and this is a men's system. So women's, again, different story. So we've got to house all of these men. Officially, the boys' prison became probation. Officially, the coal mines, which is one of the World Heritage Sites, also on the peninsula, that became probation. And they built 6 more on the peninsula in just the space of a few years. There are nearly 50 of these probation stations and gangs through Van Diemen's Land. It is a massive expenditure. And we need to keep these men busy. So what are we going to do? Here's an idea. We could rely less on imported grains. We can grow crops here, and there's some great spots on the peninsula, but if you can imagine more Richmond and Sorell, if you know Tasmania, it's most of the way back to Hobart, that's where it's all happening. And Port Arthur is going to get involved, so it's not a probation station, but it's going to support the probation system in the same way that it supported the assignment system, with a giant granary and flour mill. So if you didn't know that already, that's some drama. It's not a penitentiary, but that's not its original purpose. It's a flour mill. So it's got bars on it right from the start. It's not to keep convicts in this building, it's to keep them out of it, because there's valuable stuff in there. So this part of the building here, this is the actual granary itself, so that's the storage. The year-round fresh water is diverted, and now it comes through that hillside in a stone tunnel, which is actually still there. Pipes and flumes bring the water across the road, and it comes into this building where there is a giant water wheel. It's the full height of the building. And if you look closely at the building, you would realise it's this set of windows here. So the spacing is different. So this is a water wheel. The lintel is different at the top there as well, as you can see. And it's actually, I'm fairly certain about this, it's actually 2 separate buildings with the water wheel between them, but the roof is continuous. Especially in summer. So there's a fix, and that's what the next 50 metres is. From here, if you're far enough back, you can see where that tall column is, between here and there. That's the fix. In that section, 2 levels high, a massive wooden cylinder running that distance, like the back of a paddle steamer, and that is a convict-powered, treadmill-driven flour grinding machine. So here's an option for spending your day at Port Arthur being punished. Right, it's in 8 chunks. You can put up to 6 convicts on each chunk. A bar runs across that second level. You just hold on, and then you start stepping. Never-ending ladder. Right. And these guys have leg irons. Right, this is my mission at Port Arthur, or one of them, to make sure you all go away understanding there's simply no such thing as the ball and chain in Australian convictism, despite seeing the imagery everywhere. Right, you can't work dragging something behind you, and they have to work. So instead, the weight's on both ankles. So there's a chain between it, you clip it up to your belt, you try and make it comfortable. It's not comfortable, never. These guys don't even own socks. And if you do anything to make it comfortable, like stuffing rags down there, that's an offence. That's interfering with your irons. Light irons are anything under the equivalent of 6 kilograms. So now with 1 kilo or 2 on each ankle, yeah, good luck on the step up. Right, it's just constant injuries, just keeping up with everyone else. At least one guy dies on this thing. I think it's probably more. So I'm sure they were thrilled when they learned 3 years later, just in 1848, shut down. Right, I cannot tell you how much money they wasted on this building. Right, it's kind of disastrous, the water thing, but it's more a failure of that probation system itself. Right, it is driving the colony bankrupt. This is something we are still recovering from. And while this building closes, it just becomes a largely useless store for that period. The probation system is the main reason, not the sole reason, but definitely the main reason why then 5 years later in 1853, transportation will end to Van Diemen's Land. So after that point, the next 15 years was just to Western Australia. And it became Tasmania in 1856. But in 1853, when transportation ended, it also meant they're closing Norfolk Island, which by that stage was being administered by Van Diemen's Land, officially slotted in below Port Arthur. That's closing. Those men have to come somewhere. They're coming to Port Arthur, and we could do with some accommodation. So the conversion, and in 1857 it becomes the penitentiary. Right. As promised, that's my first self-contained talk. That's big stuff, and that should really set you up for your day. So if that's all you want, enjoy your afternoon. If you want to know about the penitentiary itself, I'm going to go inside. See how you go. It'll be, for instance, those fresh bricks up there. You see that's where the water wheel was again, and that's that set of windows behind you. Other things, they changed the floor levels. So if you look up here, there's now that lintel halfway up the window. So that's the new ceiling level above your head. That's where the ceiling is. Here, above our heads, there's a walkway, a gallery to access these two levels. Because this is the most important part about the penitentiary conversion, is the introduction through these two levels, right around the corner and everything, 136 individual cells. So it's individual management at Port Arthur. Right, this is part of the bigger story again. Right, Port Arthur's a maximum security prison, and hopefully you might get it out of today. It's also a modern prison. Right, it's not too dissimilar. It's expensive to keep men in maximum security. They don't want them to be here. If you can be managed in those other levels, that's where they want you to be. So there are no hanky stealers at Port Arthur, right? To encourage people to leave, religion, trade, training, that's the best one for the convicts. The discipline and punishment, and separation and classification. That's the most subtle one, but this is where it's best expressed, right? Individual management. So this person can be managed differently to this person.
So that's the size of the cell.
That's the size of these cells, yep. So, and you can see the roof level, right? Got that? Yep. So your cells are kind of small. If you can see the ring bolts up there, right? So there's a set down here for me, and then there'll be another set at the front here. Leather straps between them. This is your bed. So it's a bit hammocky, but it's mattress. If you haven't been to the separate prison already, you should go there, but you can see what the beds look like up there. You've got some shelves in here. You've got a shelf for your lamp, your Bible, which is essential, your water bucket, and your toilet bucket would be down there. For those of you who can see, in the back of the cells there's a big hole here. This has pressed tin on it and holes through it. You could get away with talking to that person on the other side. It's not permitted, but they need this stuff because respiratory illnesses is a huge problem at Port Arthur and it needs circulation. You'll see holes at all sorts of places around the building. That's what it's about. Because you're out every day working, right? And you don't have a rain jacket. Convict stuff is quality stuff, but still, you've only got 2 uniforms. The other one's in the laundry down there. You only get it back each week. So when you come back, if you're out first day of the week and it's muddy and wet out there, you don't have pajamas. Yeah, you've got a couple of blankets, quality again, but there's no heating in these cells. Right? So respiratory illness is a huge problem in Port Arthur, and that's why there's an 80-bed hospital. But if you do what you're told, it's not an issue. You've got an easier job. Because right, these are your cells, and you are on your own, but they are not solitary cells. They're separate cells. Right, so there's a fine distinction in this. And the reason for the distinction, the whole building is actually misnamed. So it was called the Penitentiary. It's not a penitentiary because it's not a jail. The whole place is the jail. So more correctly, it's called the convict barracks. Right, so every day these cells empty out. And these are the guys who are doing the worst jobs out there. The people that designed the penitentiary and that do the conversion, they said if you're in these cells on this bottom level, your leg irons are going to be 50 pounds, which is the equivalent of 18 kilograms. Right? Fairly certain that that didn't really happen. But the museum in Hobart has a set that are 18 kilograms. You can't walk in them. But if you can imagine more between 6 and 12 kilograms, that's what you've got, right? It's tough. It's definitely tough. Commandant Boyd, who's through this period, he likes to bring his visitors through here and introduce them to the lions. Like it's like visiting the zoo. These are the worst behaved men at Port Arthur and they have made the worst decisions. Right? So don't judge Port Arthur based on these cells. Right? If you think the other guys are being treated better, that's the separation, change behaviour. Look at what they're doing. Right? And move up into the second level. So still individual, but those guys have got the lighter iron, so you can imagine up to the 6 kilograms. But the main part of the building is actually missing. So the 4th level up there, That's where most of the convicts are. There's bunks against both walls. There's some dividers, but essentially it's just one big open room with 350 men up there. So it's kind of crowded, but again, it's only overnight. Right, so they're bricking all the windows because there's beds against them. There's no $1 million views, but it is nice up there. It's big and spacious, big shingle roof, there's skylights, so it's kind of life for yourself. So there's a lot of like allegory about the religion and rising towards heaven. And up there, they don't have toilet buckets because you can move through the building, right? Some restrictions. They don't have leg irons on up there. They've got a nicer uniform, so it's a nicer colour at least. So it's blue. These guys, have you ever seen the half yellow, half grey? Right, that's a punishment uniform, and that's what you're wearing down here. They get to go down and out the back, where the ablutions yards are and the exercise yards. Some great archaeology out there, if you haven't been out there already. And by the end of it, at the end of the ablutions yard, they have hot and cold running water here. Right? So that's ahead of its time, in a sense. Don't ask me too much about it. But it's definitely associated with all the heat down there. So I mentioned the laundry, that's the chimney, but also that next slice of the building that came with the conversion, that's the bakery. So there's just so much stuff going on. And they're great engineers, so that's not too much of a challenge for them. Third floor is a dining area, right? Big, spacious, quality. In the evenings, effectively a school. So that was a huge experiment they were doing with the boys out there, but that was extended to the men. If they want to learn to read and write, they are taught. About 10% of men choose to do it. And if they don't choose to do it, then there's that religious and moral instruction. And this building has a library on that third floor, right? Which is incredible in itself, because it's a convict era library for convicts. And despite all of that, there's more than 13,000 books in the library. So no one seems to know really why it has so many books. They're donated books, but the clergy complain that there's not enough religious text amongst them. Men are reading whatever they want, and while most of the books are missing, Port Arthur has some great books. One of them's a fantastic book about reptiles and amphibians. And around here, where this glass bridge is, up there, this is part of another story really, but have people been to the church? Don't miss it, it's beautiful. Not so much info up there, but the most important thing about the church is the fact that it was called the church. So it didn't have a name, doesn't have a denomination. All the men are welcome to attend, and it's run by the Wesleyans, who are the future Methodists, and it's all going well, but of course it doesn't last because of religion. The Reverend Durham comes, he's Anglican, he offends all the Catholics, that's the subject of his sermons, what's wrong with the Catholics? Causes them to refuse to go to church, which then they're not punished for because the administration knew it was Durham that was the problem. Separate services up there, that's all happening, but it was never the Catholic Church, even though they were using it. And they eventually got bumped out to wooden buildings, but by 1857, when we've got the Penitentiary, that's where they put the Roman Catholic chapel. So everything above that glass bridge. Right, so it's a lot less fancy, a lot less reverential than the church, but if you're Catholic, great news, because this one had stained glass. So nicer windows.
Tasmanian's beer is available?
Yeah, Tasmanian.
Oh, yes it is. We're gonna go look at the boys' prison and the Island of the Dead. Isle of the Dead? Okay.
Welcome aboard the Marana for your harbour cruise. Just a brief safety announcement. Please be aware that there are life jackets in the marked compartments at the front of the vessel as well as upstairs, and in the event of an emergency, please take direction from the crew. Thank you. Now, this settlement of Port Arthur, of course, was a notorious prison, officially a secondary punishment station, a place where they incarcerated what were considered to be the most incorrigible or incurable criminals within this colony of Van Diemen's Land. Now, the general scheme of this place, of course, was that men would be put to hard labour, gathering raw materials, and other men would be put to task making things from those raw materials. Port Arthur always had an industrial side. Now, the most plentiful and most valuable raw material here was timber. Various species of eucalypts, which were described as being 150 feet to the first branch. Convicts produced anything from broomsticks to boats and ships, and this clearing we're coming alongside on your left-hand side was the dockyard where they produced around 200 vessels altogether. The majority of these were longboats or whale boats. Whaling was a major industry in this early colony of Van Diemen's Land, so you can imagine craft like that being in big demand, and ships would travel from all over the world to hunting these very fertile waters. A longboat is a very similar craft, but they were used to transport goods and personnel around the bays and inlets of this early colony, when travel across country was often quite difficult, if not totally impossible. But they built larger ships as well. The largest ship built at Port Arthur was 286 tonnes. She was also the largest ship built in the colony at that point in time. And what you can see sitting in one of the old slipways is an artist's sculptural representation of one of those craft under construction. Now, the operation of the dockyard was fairly independent of the rest of Port Arthur. They had their own blacksmith shops where they could make their own metal fittings and fastenings. They had their own saw pits. They used to use steamers. Steamers allowed the timber. Problems with Point Poor was about resources and the fact that it was such a cold, windswept place. All resources had to be taken over there, and this includes water even, all the materials for their trades, rations, etc. So this almost guaranteed contact between the boys and convicts who were performing that task, and the thriving black market would grow because of that, tobacco being the main currency of course. But it's a very important historic site, the first sanctioned juvenile prison under British control. There is nothing else between us and that very cold place, apart from the absolutely vast expanse which is the Southern Ocean. The cliffs of Point Poor, of course, are quite prominent as well, and boys would scramble down those cliffs and gather on the rocks out of view, and they would light fires, cook potatoes that they'd stolen, catch fish, smoke tobacco. Thomas Lampierre, the commissariat here, stood on top of the cliff and looked down. He said they scuttled away like little crabs. If you look towards Isle of the Dead once more and put an imaginary line down the centre of that, the left-hand side is the southern end, convicts, etc. But the right-hand side of the island, the higher ground, was reserved for burial of free people. These were members of the military, civilian establishment, and members of their families. About 180 men, women and children, and given their status, they received due.
We had a great time visiting Port Arthur Historic Site. We learned so much. We sailed out of Port Arthur along the Tasman Sea. The Port Arthur Historical Site is at the southern tip of the Tasman Peninsula, and it's about 62 miles southeast of Hobart. That's our next port of call, Hobart, Tasmania. We will be in port in a few hours. On our way, we sailed by the Tasman Peninsula. Ay chihuahua! The Tasman Peninsula is freaking crazy, with dramatic sea cliffs, caves, waterfalls. Our cruise brought us up close to these amazing natural attractions. We were told we might spot dolphins, seals, even migrating whales. We didn't look for any sea life because we were just in awe looking at the cliffs. It was an amazing experience. As we sailed into Hobart, we sailed by the Iron Pot Lighthouse, located on Iron Pot Island in Storm Bay. It was constructed in 1832 with, of course, convict labor. Iron Pot Lighthouse is the oldest lighthouse in Tasmania and the oldest original tower in Australia. It was beautiful as we were sailing by it. Thank you for watching. We would love to hear if you've been to Tasmania. Leave a comment down below. Ciao for now.